how are they going to reconnect with large proportions of the electorate that really, really dislike them?
And the positions they take aren't even particularly popular ones.
That's an economic divide and a cultural divide, an educational divide.
From the social media perspective as well, I really feel this re-emergence of a gender divide. I didn't expect it to be done by the time that I had woken up, but it was.
Partly why they're counting a lot faster. You know, my wife's from New York City, my daughter's in New York, son in London, all watching the election in different time zones and watching them come in. I was thinking, and I saw the Florida count really fast, and I was thinking that looks like a Trump, significantly more Trump-leaning than the polls were saying. And I was thinking, is there like something odd going on about Florida? And we're not going to find out until the morning. So went to bed and got up. And were you surprised by it?
I think everyone was surprised by the margin.
Right.
I think that this is completely unexpected. Once again, a surprising result from the perspective of the polls, if nothing else. Raises some questions about what exactly they're doing, and there's been all the retrospectives about the previous two elections. How can they be so consistently wrong and in the same direction?
Well, I think, Nate Silver, top pollster, he had this great line. He said, most likely outcome of the election is that Harris wins all the swing states, and the second most likely outcome is that Trump wins all the swing states, because the polls are either all wrong in one direction or all wrong in another direction, because they're all in a sense retrofitting to the last election. And
yes,
that's you retrofit the weightings to predict the last election. Of course, the next election is something different. But they do seem to systematically underestimate support for Trump, which is a general global phenomenon, systematically underrating support for radical right parties. We don't know if this is either a shy voters not willing to
Tory,
admit, shy Tory, shy Trumper, or this is just there just aren't enough people they can reach who actually are willing to be in online polling panels or answer the phone or answer the door, or who are willing to. They just can't reach a bunch of people who they need to be able to sample properly. We just don't know what it is.
Right, that's right. And it seems as if the composition of the electorate in the US context is also changing a bit from one presidential cycle to the next, where the real problem is modeling who the likely voters are. And if this is in fact endogenous to the campaign that's being run and all these other factors, it's hard to really, maybe this is as good as polls can do.
Yeah, and there's also another side to this, which is that, it wasn't a surprise to me that by the end, all the major pollsters were all predicting a dead heat, because ultimately the pollsters are risk averse, right? So, I remember a very senior pollster in London commenting a few elections ago saying that, the public opinion polling is essentially the Formula One of the polling industry. They've got to be seen to be doing it, and they waste a lot of money doing it, but they've got to do it because it generates money, generates clients for their real business, which is the consumer stuff. And so the most important thing in the public opinion polls, the kind of election polls, is not to be wrong.
Right.
So it's okay for everybody to be collectively wrong, but what they can't be is you're an outlier and they're wrong and everyone's right. So I think there is an element of herding. They all kind of came around to the idea of, it's a coin toss, we don't know. And so they can all be collectively wrong, and that's fine from them from a business point of view.
Yeah, that's at a certain point, maybe the business consumers will also decide, actually, these people don't know what they're doing. Like, this entire industry is not something that really functions at all if they're so consistently wrong. And collectively, it's not a question of this firm being better than that firm.
They're all bad.
Yeah, so we should use social media, or we should use just our gut or some other thing.
So on the social media side, I mean, were there people doing kind of social media modeling or trying to predict the elections with social media, as opposed to the standard way of doing it with?
So this is a long-standing question. Yes, how can we use public opinion in this sense? Sentiment on social media. I think that this used to be more common. People have largely given up on it simply because the representativeness question is so challenging. And the data access on the biggest platforms is also now much more expensive and complicated than it once was. So you could use a more niche platform like Twitter or Reddit or something like this in order to try to do this election prediction, but the self-selection problems are just so large.
I mean, was there anything that really stuck out for you in terms of the social media side to the election? I mean, I remember, 4 years ago, everyone was saying, social media is going to have this big impact on the election, polarization of the public, echo chambers, misinformation, all the rest of it. I mean, we're now 4 years later. Do you think all of that has kind of come true, or is now that sort of priced in how we understand elections?
I think it should be more priced in than it is. I think it has now been, I would say, at least 8 years that since 2016, the Trump election was when the idea of misinformation on social media really burst onto the scene. But I mean, going back, the Obama digital campaign strategy was very highly lauded all the way back in 2008. So it's been close to 20 years now where social media and the internet has been a pretty primary part of how politics is conducted. That said, I do think social media changes pretty dramatically, much faster than there are presidential elections.
Right.
So if anything,
social media today means something very different to 4 years ago.
And if anything, the campaigns, just like the pollsters, trying to update on the social media strategies from the past, might be learning the wrong lessons unless they're really up to date on new developments on social media.
Well, for example, I saw data saying that under 25s get the bulk of their news information from TikTok. So, I mean, I find that difficult to conceptualize, but what does that mean in terms of getting your political news from TikTok?
I think that part of the problem is that the existence of TikTok changes the nature of what political news is. Right. So they're not getting reports of news anchors reading economic statistics, but that's just changing what news and politics means to young people. They are getting the first-person accounts of people like them describing their experience of the economy. And so the way in which people think about the economy, younger people using these new modalities, I think is different, is a bit divorced. There had been a question in the US about this divergence between subjective experiences of the economy, which were quite negative, and the objective indicators, which were generally quite positive. And I think a big part of the explanation is young people can get information from a wide variety of their peers directly about how they're experiencing things. And so the need to appeal to some objective unemployment rate is unnecessary. And also those numbers are actually kind of more abstract.
Much more, yeah.
So it's maybe less useful for people in terms of evaluating how the country is going.
I mean, is your sense that the Trump and the Harris campaigns ran very different social media strategies, or did they sort of converge on a particular strategy? Like, for example, there was a lot of talk about, the growth of now micro-targeting, and, using micro-targeting, particularly through social media, figuring out these are the key voters we need to reach. We can target a particular message for that type of voter through the sort of social media that they're consuming. I mean, was that a big change from 4 years ago, or was that any difference between the two campaigns? That's quite interesting.
I would say it's actually gone a bit in the other direction, where micro-targeting, it seems as though this was part of the big promise of Facebook. It's part of their business model is to say to advertisers, we have better data on what people are interested in, and so we're allowing you to micro-target your ads. But looking at the political science literature, it doesn't really seem that there haven't been that many silver bullets that have been found in terms of these heterogeneous messages that really only appeal to a very slight audience. And insofar as that is possible, I think the way they have done it is by appealing to specific influencers. Right. So you go to the influencer, they have an audience, a niche, and it's defined by the fact that they like that influencer. And so the influencer already knows what that audience wants, whereas the Facebook demographic style micro-targeting requires still some kind of imputation, some kind of marketing strategy. And so I think both campaigns have really embraced for the first time this cycle these political influencers.
But the explicitly political influencers or social influencers as well, the sort of Taylor Swift effect. But I was thinking, but political influencers and social influencers, isn't there already a lot endogenous there? And if you're following an influencer already who's a political influencer, you kind of know what they're going to say. They're not going to move the dial really. And if you're following, Taylor Swift comes out supporting Harris, big whoop, that was so unsurprising. Would have been more of an effect, ironically, had she just come out and said, I'm supporting Trump. So isn't there strong priors that people have when they're kind of tuning into these influences?
Certainly, people are not consuming media at random. And I think, though, that I kind of fell into the trap that I diagnosed others as falling into, where by talking about political influencers, this is I think, a broader category of communicative actor than someone who has a website which says, I talk about politics. There are these people who are, let's say, social commentators. Right. Taylor Swift primarily a musician, right? So she doesn't do that much social commentary. But there are a number of these really quite large podcasts which are not explicitly political. They talk about politics sometimes, but they talk about all sorts of topics of interest to people. And both campaigns did spend some time on these distinct podcasts. And I think these are the ones that, first of all, are targeting a younger audience and are targeting the kind of relatively low political interest voters who you might be able to actually entice to turn out in one election who don't usually vote in another.
So were you surprised, given watching what was going on in the campaigns, were you surprised at the fact Trump wins by like quite a significant margin, more than was expected? I mean, was it, it seems like the Democrats and Kamala Harris, they had a pretty effective, although it wasn't such a, it's a pretty short campaign, 107 days from when she came, they had a lot of money, they had raised a lot of money very quickly. They're very tech savvy. I mean, they're connected into a lot of the media influences in their kind of field of politics, if you like. I mean, what went wrong in that sense from their perspective?
I think that this is certainly establishing sort of once again the limits of the importance of money in politics. Right. That it clearly is not dispositive, or else we don't know the counterfactual. Perhaps it would have been even more of a bloodbath. But to me, the top line result is Kamala Harris was never very popular. Right. This is what the primary established in 2020. There was a wealth of opinion polling about this as when she was the vice president. Just not a particularly popular candidate. So given that baseline, I agree they did about as well as they could do. But the fundamental problem was, in my view, Joe Biden deciding to try to run again, failing to do so, and then producing this kind of diminutive campaign as opposed to a full-fledged, very strategic effort that we could have seen. We talked about these top-line results, but so what are you surprised about in terms of the specifics of who voted for and how that changed? Well,
so, I mean, the most striking thing for me was how uniform the swing was, right? Across, uniform across geography, uniform across socio-demographic groups. It was like a 3 or 4% swing from Democrats to Republicans, from Biden to Trump, almost across every way you cut it, apart from some very, very specific groups, sort of black women, but it was amongst the young, particularly young men and women, middle-aged men and women, educated, non-educated. It was like a 3 or 4% swing. It doesn't, the baselines, of course, are very, very different. Right. Certain groups already are far more Republican or far more Democrat. And I think what that suggests to me, it was an anti-incumbency vote. Yes. She wasn't a great candidate. Biden wasn't popular. There'd been a big inflation effect, and inflation is like an exogenous shock that affects everybody in different ways. If you're wealthy, it means your holiday is more expensive, but if you're poor, it means your grocery shopping is more expensive. Yes. So it's affecting everybody in different ways, and of course, lower income groups are affected more proportionally. But it was something. Then I was thinking, listening and watching the campaign in hindsight, I don't recall her talking about the economy. It's almost like she wanted to differentiate herself by saying, look, we're not going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about what we think of as the other dimension of politics. We're going to talk about identity. We're going to talk about immigration. We're going to talk about democracy in the guise and potentially an authoritarian. And that meant that she didn't address, I think, what was clearly what now we can see as was clearly the dominant concern of large portions of the electorate, which was essentially just basic bog standard economics, which, particularly cost of living, inflation prices. I mean, and I think, inflation has been an issue area in many, many democracies across the world, and it was in the British election, it was in the Dutch election, but I get a sense it's far more of an issue in the US in this election because there's been such a long period of very, very low inflation in the US, and a sort of industrial working class in the US have always felt like they've got a lot of consumer power. That was always what it was. Everybody could afford a car and a house and a holiday and a good school for the kids, and that was and that consumer power has gradually been eroded by globalization and changing wage structures. And then on top of that, you get this big whack over the head of inflation, and suddenly everyone's going, "Wow, we can't afford as a family to do what we used to do," and a feel-good joy campaign doesn't pay the bills.
Right. Yes. So yeah, I mean, it seems that people are trying to read the tea leaves and really look at something more, specific, precise, something, if only we'd done this differently, we could have gotten this big block of voters to move in a different direction. But your take is simply, is there anything they could have done? And so maybe they could have talked about the economy more, but given the macroeconomic conditions, I saw, every incumbent has lost across the world this year.
Right, exactly. So, yeah. And I think, so it's not to say, this affects at the margins. This does not explain everything. And it doesn't explain why there is this big, solid support for Trump-style politics in general. There are why is it that lower income voters are voting for the right, and a very populist right, and a potentially quite authoritarian right? It doesn't answer that. It doesn't answer why is there such very strong anti-immigrant sentiment that of course he can tap into. It doesn't answer that. And it also doesn't answer another way of reading the outcome is, are we ever going to be able to see a woman elected in the US? A black woman is a particularly difficult sell against an electorate that is quite sexist and quite racist. But that would have suggested to me those kind of explanations. You get differential swings. And it's not, you did get some, but not much. Like you get black men switching to vote for Trump. That you get women, working class women switching and voting for Trump. And what I also found interesting was how the ballot initiatives on reproductive rights passed almost everywhere. They didn't pass in Florida because they needed to get 60%, and they got 57%. But so you clearly had large groups of voters who were going out voting for Trump, and then voting in favor of reproductive rights for women, which really undermined her kind of campaign. Trump is a threat to women. And I think he's able to say, well, it's up to the states now. It's like, I'm not going to touch that. And so, he flip-flopped and was ambiguous on whether there would be a national ban on abortion. But I think there's a big... So I think it's quite obvious in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, that this was going to be a very, very difficult election for her to win, given Biden's record, given the economic shock of inflation in particular, given the fact that she only has 100 days to put the campaign together. And we can talk about could other candidates have been different. But there's a big broader question, I think, about the Democratic leadership and the Democratic Party and, how are they going to reconnect with large proportions of the electorate that really, really dislike them? Think that they're out of touch, think that, you put a bunch of Hollywood celebs on the platform and, Taylor Swift and Beyonce and Bruce Springsteen and Eminem and, the average voter out there is going, they're flying around in private jets. They're not helping me pay my bills. What's your perspective?
No, I think it's a sobering way to put it, but I think this is right. And I think part of the problem is just how surprised the people in our sort of circles are and have been about this. And I think that speaks to the fact that the Democratic Party has been increasingly the party of people like us. And this is a serious problem. It does not seem as though this is going to be solved by fiddling around at the margins with messaging, that it is a deeper question about how the party operates. And
but in some ways, Biden himself, in terms of the actual economic policies of Biden, this is quite a Keynesian presidency in terms of expansionary economic policies, big infrastructure program, get the economy moving again, big public spending. Ironically, Trump might benefit from that in the medium term, just because these things take a long time to connect, or to have an effect on people's lives. But there's a deep, and not just the US, but I think it's a deep thing across many advanced economies, a growing urban-rural divide that's an economic divide and a cultural divide and a whole, an educational divide. And the whole economic and political geography has changed over the last 30 years with globalization, with technological change, with educational expansion. And I think a lot of centre-left parties across the world are finding it very difficult to appeal to constituencies they largely took for granted. And these constituencies are angry at stop the world, I want to get off. They feel like, the world is moving away from them. And some people call this status loss. Other people point to objective economic decline of areas, boarded up high streets or this sort of thing. Some people point to sort of concerns about cultural changes in the neighborhood or growing ethnic diversity in the neighborhoods or changing social values. And you see a big there's certainly a gender politics dimension to that. Rural areas tend to be more male as women move to cities. Women, a lot of the new jobs being created in the economy are so-called, women's jobs as opposed to traditional man's jobs. I saw data that suggested that in most advanced economies now, you're far more likely to be employed as a woman with just a high school education than a man with just a high school education. Because as a woman with just a high school education, there's the growth of the services sector, elderly care, childcare, nursing care, as well as all the service sector jobs. And the traditional male jobs with just a high school education is sort of industrial jobs, manufacturing, and they're traditionally in decline. And so you're seeing this growing, women have overtaken men on the educational dimension, and women have overtaken men in terms of sort of economic power, particularly amongst lower skilled. And so I think there's a lot of very deep socioeconomic changes that have happened over the last 30 years. And a lot of centre-left parties are still saying, like, the concerns that they tend to talk about in their elections, I don't want to be critical, and these are important things they talk about, but it seems like a lot of the concerns or the policy agenda they talk about in these elections are not really the real concerns of a lot of these rural areas. I mean,
that seems absolutely right, and the positions they take aren't even particularly popular ones. So I think that makes it even more challenging to run a campaign. I think from the social media perspective as well, I really feel this reemergence of a gender divide, especially among younger generations, whereas older generations, I think, had been raised in a context in which media was less fragmented. But we see across the developed world this large divide between men becoming more conservative, women becoming more liberal. I think it is a consequence and cause of the material conditions you're describing, and I think that the media that is produced for young people is increasingly divided along gender lines, which I think is causing further polarization. And
some of the political influences you were talking about targeted very much at sort of young, angry white men, sort of,
Well, there are some that are targeted at women, but certainly, the most popular podcast in the world.
Andrew Tates of the world.
Andrew Tate is an extreme version of it, right? He's less popular, but he is a perfect example of someone who really has beliefs and views that are beyond the pale, but is quite popular. But Joe Rogan, right, is clearly someone who some members of respectable society, the Democratic coalition, had written off as a Trumpist or a conspiracist or someone who we should consider outside of our coalition, has the most popular podcast in the world, invited both candidates to go on it. Trump did, Harris did not. And so in terms of the audience I'm describing, that does seem, if I were to point to one campaign decision, that seems like the most influential.
But in terms also when we think about what the potential consequences of the election are, which is a whole other side of it that I think we will start to see over the next 6 months to a year emerging. I mean, the role of the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is starting to be fearful of Trump. I was really struck by the sort of Washington Post deciding not to endorse a candidate when, the editorial team had been ready to say we're going to endorse Harris, and Bezos, the owner, it seemed like had come down and said no. And, is there a problem here when the media starts to be owned by very wealthy individuals who are very connected to potential political candidates and, the whole independence of the media as a kind of fourth estate holding the government to account? I mean, does it bring all that into question?
I think so. I think these have been eroding for a long time, and it's sort of a surprise that it took so long given the increase in wealth inequality, for the billionaires to catch on to just what an important lever it was. But I think 2016 was what, again, caused, because there was this mobilization to say, we the experts are going to try to stake out the high ground on what kind of things are allowed to be talked about or not. And in my mind, the Bezos and the Washington Post is important, but Musk and buying Twitter.
I was about to say, Musk, you think that really had an influence or what?
I do. I think in terms of, let's just compare it to misinformation. The research on misinformation suggested it's just not that much of it circulating online. What is circulating is taken down relatively quickly. Not that many people are exposed to it. The ones who are tend to be in a cluster of people who are conspiracists and are seeking this out. But the number of people who saw content on Twitter, now X, over the past 2 years, which has moved to the right really substantially, is gigantic.
And also the algorithm has fundamentally changed,
Yes.
right? It's not, they're feeding you stuff on X. I mean,
Yes.
I'm a bit of an X addict myself, but
Yes.
they're feeding you stuff on X that you just
So
you
you know what I
haven't
mean,
signed
yeah.
up to. It's just there now. It didn't used to be like that.
And so that's a big important, that's I think maybe the biggest media effect.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing some academic studies about this because it obviously will take a few years to fully understand what has happened. But the shift, everyone who uses X can experience it, has been dramatic.
Well, this is fun, Kevin. I mean, very interesting to talk to you about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so this has been great. Yeah, I really enjoyed getting to catch up and learning about your
Yeah,
expertise.
thanks. Great fun.
Yeah.